It is great to welcome to the program Jordan Belfort, who's a former stockbroker, author, motivational speaker. He's author of the book The Wolf of Wall Street, ultimately adapted into the blockbuster film by the same name back in 2013. Jordan, so great to have you on today.
My pleasure. What's going on?
So I have so many areas where we could start, but I think maybe one place would be, I've read your book, I've seen the movie. Are you pleased with the way the book was adapted into the movie, and how much of a say did you have over that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I was very pleased. It's pretty much hard to go wrong with Scorsese and DiCaprio leading the way. And Terry Winter was the screenwriter who adapted my book, and I worked very closely with all of them, especially with Leo and with Terry Winter. So I wrote all of the boardroom scenes and the language and the motivational speeches and the sales pitches and all that stuff. So it was a really collaborative experience. Just a great um, great taste in my mouth when it was all over. And for that matter, I mean, like I think that the proof speaks in the audience, like how they responded. I mean, the movie became like pretty much the biggest cult hit of all time. So it's up there with Rocky Horror, I think, in these days that people just watch it again and again and again, and it just keeps expanding. So I'm very pleased.
And what about in terms of, I mean, when I read your book, there's a lot more in the book about sort of like your state of mind as you were going through everything that you did. And that can be hard to translate into a movie that's a couple hours long from a 400 or 500 page book, or however long it was. It felt very short, to be clear, but it was not a short book. So what
Yeah.
about your sort of mindset as you were going through the building of the firm and everything that happened?
Yeah, well, I think that if there was one source of frustration with the movie, it was yeah, it was pretty much that aspect. I think that they one thing they missed was the slow de-evolution of ethics and integrity. Like I didn't. It was like in the movie. It's like I go down to Wall Street. I'm like this really idealistic young guy. I'm like, can't we make our clients money? And they're like, no, you can't. And the next scene, I'm with like at a strip club snorting coke. Right? That didn't happen. I mean, that I went there as a very good kid, never got in trouble for it. And it was over a period of years, as slowly but surely, one step over that ethical line ate away at my moral center for that period of time. Before you know it, you're doing things you thought you'd never do, and it seems perfectly okay. So, I mean, that part kind of got left out of the movie. In addition, I think a lot of the idea, of, people say, well, you felt like almost like there was no guilt involved. I mean, every single day I was, felt terrible and saw what was going on. And I felt like I was almost like, an actor on a stage in my own life, and just sort of going through the motions. That's a very common feeling that a lot of people who are very successful and when things are spiraling out of control, you almost feel, and it's not true. It's just a feeling you have. You start to believe that you can't get off the revolving, there's like sort of, the elevators going up and down. You just can't get off, and you really can. So those things didn't make it into the movie. And but the good news is it's a TV series that's going to be coming out next year, early next year, late this year. And that will really delve much deeper into all that stuff and also what happened before and after.
So for people who don't know, there was an FBI investigation that in the book, in with the 2020 hindsight that you have when you were writing the book, you talk about how long it had actually been going on, and it had been going on quite a long time into you. You detail the drug addiction in the book. With all of this stuff, can you talk a little bit about how from the outside it can seem like you say, like from one day to the next, things are crazy and you're in completely over your head, but that in reality, it's a little bit at a time that you take one step and
Yeah.
then you take another small step. And then before you know it, you're sort of in over your head.
Yeah. Again, it's like we as human beings, we become desensitized to the same things that happen again and again. I'll give you an example. The first time I ever got a subpoena from an agency, it was the NASD, which is a regulatory body. And I think it's called FINRA now, right? And they sent me this subpoena and I was devastated. I was like, oh my God, I couldn't sleep for a month, right? Flash forward 3 years, 4 years. I'm like, I got a subpoena from the SEC, a real agency, and I'm like pissing on it. It's like, fuck you. It's like, and it's shocking that you can get to that point. But what happens is as the mind works, is that unless you do that, you'll go crazy. You have to sort of learn to cubbyhole it, put it in its own little box, and go on. And that's how you rationalize your life away, right? And that can work to your advantage and also to your disadvantage, depending on the situation. It's a protective mechanism, so you can continue focusing and moving forward without going crazy, right? But it also leads to behaviors that become, skewed irrationally or massively to one side of the equation, because you've lost the gut check. You've kind of the realities have been blocked away, and then you're just acting without that.
So when you're in the midst of it, you said that it's not right to portray the idea that you had no reservations about what you were doing and that you had no guilt, so to speak. But when you're in it, what is the sort of like rationalizing mechanism that happens where you say, well, I'm 9 steps in, at this point I'm taking step 10, for example? Like what is going on in your mind as you continue to get deeper into it?
So you remember that there's a very big difference to what I did to what someone like a Bernie Madoff did. So like a
That's right.
Bernie Madoff was a complete fraud. There was no thing being born. It was all fiction. That, in my case, 95% plus of what I was doing was legal. So what you end up doing is you focus on the legal stuff, right? And then you say, but everyone's doing the other stuff too. So you look to everyone's doing it. So like you can't use that argument. If you're a criminal robbing houses, you can't use that. But if you're in the area where I was, which is like this sort of gray area where like you're doing most things right and you have this one little thing that's wrong, now in reality, that's still illegal, right? But you're able to then sort of say something, it's mostly legal and everyone's doing that anyway. I'm just better at it. And that's sort of the rationalizing process. So I think that's how a lot of people, like for instance, when you have like, you see like a Wall Street guy who's doing 90% of everything right. Like what was a big one? Sanjay something or other. It was a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund. And the guy got caught doing insider trading. Yet it was a legitimate hedge fund. Everything was right. And probably, if he did 100 trades, 5 were on inside information. 1 is enough to get you thrown in jail, right? But he's saying to himself, well, everyone's doing it. And most of what I do is lily white. So, that's how it really it gets played out in your own mind.
So I want to get your thoughts on just the regulation of the financial industry a little bit. But in order to do that, I'm curious, from reading the book, my sense of you is that your politics are sort of like socially do whatever, you don't really care, liberal libertarian, but that on economic stuff, you might be more of what we would call like a Mitt Romney type conservative, so to speak. Am I way off on that? Is that roughly where your politics are?
That's exactly right. I mean, I'm about as socially liberal as you can get. And I wouldn't say I'm as fiscally conservative. I'm very fiscally conservative. I strongly believe that Trump is on the right track economically with the things he's doing.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, that's
yes,
interesting.
I do. On the social side of things, yeah, I'm as as liberal as you can get. Like, marry who you want, sleep with who you want. I mean, that's just like, to me, it's like I don't really understand how you can be a conservative and not be socially liberal. If you really think it through, it's idiotically ridiculous for you to think that I want the government out of my life for my business and my finances, but we should tell people who they should marry, who they should sleep with, what's right, what's wrong, who should do what they want with their body. I don't see how you can reconcile those two with a straight face. I think that in those respects, a lot of the message gets hijacked by the religious right, and they have a very powerful lobby. So the Republican Party is forced to take on positions they probably mostly don't believe in. And how could you honestly think that gay marriage is evil? I mean, it's just so stupid. I mean, like people.
I agree with you, but so you're saying you think some of the opposition is insincere from the right to gay marriage?
Absolutely. I'm sure most of them are wishing, praying. I'm sure Trump is wishing he could say things about certain. He's not. He's a Democrat his whole life. The guy. He was a Democrat. You know what I'm saying? And I'm not defending him. I think he does a lot of stupid shit, and I don't like. But all in all, I would have voted for him 100 times in a row over Hillary Clinton in a million. I mean, not even a close shot.
So I'm interested in your insight into this. Yeah, go ahead.
If she had won, I would have supported her as my president.
Yeah.
Just the same.
Right. So, okay. So when you go back to the things that you did, and again, you were working mostly within the legal framework and stepping outside of it, like you say, 5%. Donald Trump's view on economic policy is one of deregulation, right? Taking away regulations. Is your sense that the way to deal with the type of financial industry malfeasance that you were around is the solution less regulation or more regulation?
I think it's the right regulation. So
Mm,
I think that most regulations are completely ridiculous. All they do is stifle growth, they stifle competition, and they don't accomplish what they were meant to accomplish because the people who wrote them, what ends up happening is by the time the regulation passes, it got so watered down by lobbying groups and by political interests and by PACs that what you end up seeing is not a legitimate solution to what it's trying to accomplish because it's been hamstrung and there's all this horse trading going on behind the scenes. So I believe that the capitalist markets without regulation will completely run amok because that's the nature of the human beast. They need to be regulated. But that being said, the regulations that are in place need to be of the magnitude that dissuades any activity that would lead to a broker or agent not having his or her interests mutually aligned with the investor. That's the biggest thing that happens. All these situations where you have a situation where basically from the beginning, it's a bankrupt philosophy because the people who are on one side, meaning the brokers, traders, agents, whatever they are, and the people whose money that they're managing, that what's best for one is worse for the other. So
right.
you end up with churning, end up with people making misrepresentations, right? Now, the hedge fund model was theoretically a step in the right direction where you had these 2 and 20 deals where, okay, well, I'm only going to really make money if you make money at 20%. The problem with that is the 2% management fee corrupts the whole entire thing because then what happens is you get into the asset gather game. Well, I just gather enough assets. If I can gather $2-3 billion, that's 40-60 million a year I just make before I do anything. But the problem with that is then the more assets you gather, the harder it is to give people a return on those assets. You can
Right.
make a good return on small amounts of money, but it becomes difficult on large amounts. So all these hedge funds got into these 2 and 20 games. And if you look at it, Warren Buffett's right. You're much better off just buying the freaking the index because at the end of the day, all that there's two things. The two kills you every time unless it's an extraordinarily lucrative fund, and those are few and far between. And B, the other side of the equation is that they have to then justify activity. Well, okay, if I'm giving you my money, then they start to have to churn and trade to show someone, I'm doing something with your money. So there's engaging activity that creates commissions. And I think the smartest money is buy and hold for the long term. And you're much better off just buying an index than anything else. That's
So
my
let's
opinion.
go back because this is super interesting. So you and I are exactly on the same page that there is a lack of a fiduciary duty that financial professionals have to the investor, which creates misaligned incentives, the way that you're talking about. Now, what's interesting to me about that is you said economically you like what Donald Trump is doing, but Donald Trump is against putting in place some kind of a fiduciary responsibility for the financial industry like that exists with lawyers and with, for example, real estate professionals. So is that an area where you
Well,
disagree with Donald Trump?
the question you asked me was that do I agree economically? Now you're talking about regulation. They're two different things. So I agree that I think that you can't argue with success. That
Okay.
whatever Donald Trump has done, and also remember this: to
Yep.
be fair to Obama, that very much of where an economy is during a president's first term has to do with his predecessor that came before him. So it's not all Donald Trump's success here. Some of it, and I again I skew Republican, right? But you have to give Obama some credit as well, okay, for delivering the economy, even though it was anemic compared to what it is right now. It's always the economy lags. It's a
Well, let's
lagging
let's explore that in a little bit of detail. Yeah, I mean, the lag time economic theory is definitely a real thing. But like, for example, if we just look at stock market, which I think for a lot of people, the stock market is not hugely relevant to their lives.
indicator, the stock market. That's a forward indicator to me, not a lagging indicator.
So what's interesting about that is if you look at Obama's first 3 years and Trump's first 3 years, Obama's first 3 years of the stock market outperformed Trump's. How do we interpret that?
I don't look the stock market as a bogus indicator for
Okay,
anything.
got it. What
Just
do you look at?
based on cheap money, the price, interest. It's just like you can't even look at that as the health of the economy. I look at more GDP, things like that. Growth, unemployment rates. Unemployment rates in minority groups. I think those are the more important things. The real wage increases. So I think those are far more telling signs for the economy than the stock market.
And what do you think is the lag time? In other words, for how many months during president number two do we attribute the economy to the person that came before them, so to speak?
Well, I think there's two. Remember, there's two factors involved here, right? There's the policies, and then there's the mindset, right? So, in other words, you have a president that's a cheerleader for business, that promotes business. It creates confidence in people, so people start to spend more because they believe things will loosen up and get better. So all of a sudden, you have this a consequence simply from someone saying they're going to loosen regulations, which makes people spend money, which results in growth, versus when people think that laws are going to change, taxes are going to go up, and all these things, people will start to clamp their financial belts tighter because of what they believe to be the future being slower. So there's this immediate impact of just having someone saying, here's what I'm going to do, and it becomes almost a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Doesn't
That's
that
number
only
one.
apply though to like really the top of the economy? Because the average person who's barely
Now,
saving, well, let me just lay it out and I'll give you time to respond. The average person who is like, okay, what's toilet paper costing right now? What's my food costing? They're not really being influenced by possible future changes to the tax law, right? I mean, that doesn't seem to make any sense.
I disagree with that.
Really?
I think that's the argument Elizabeth Warren made when she said, "Oh, or the crumbs." Who was that on Nancy Pelosi about the crumbs? When you give someone a tax break and they get back a check for $1,000 or $1,500, that's a lot of money for the average family. That's a lot of money. And also, in addition, all those people have credit cards. In other words, so much of it is consumer confidence. So it all comes. Remember, the country reflects the collective will of all the people within the country. It's not just a few Machiavellian people at the top. You know, there's people who are we're a consumer-based economy. We're not a manufacturing-based economy. Most of our economy is based on consumer spending and financial products. The days of us being a manufacturing base, well, Trump is trying to bring that back. But come on, I mean, that's not what we do. It's not like the 1800s anymore. Massive amount of economic growth here is based on consumer spending and financial instruments that are all focused on Wall Street. That's just the bottom line. The way
Yeah,
our
I guess
economy.
where I'm concerned, and I mean, my view is clear, but I'm not a black white person on this. In other words, I want to looking at the details. Where I get,
Why?
yeah, no, I know. Where I get concerned is, for example, when they did the tax reform in 2017, people started seeing a little bit more money in their paychecks. But part of that was not really a tax cut. It was that the withholding tables were changed. So during the year, people had a little bit more money. And at the end of the year, they got a smaller refund, and their effective tax rate was basically the same. Some people a little more, some people a little less. If your
That's right.
additional spending is based on a misunderstanding of your tax rate, isn't that bad in the long term?
I disagree with you. That's not. I think what you just said is incorrect.
Really?
Okay, I don't have the actual figures in front of me. Yeah, I think that's incorrect. By the way,
Huh.
the effective tax rates go down. Not for everybody, but for a massive amount of people, tax rates did go down. The things I didn't like, just to say, I think there were certain things that really were unfair.
Yeah.
For instance, is you're penalized heavily for being in a state that has high state taxes, California or New York, where you can no longer write your state deductions off against your federal tax. I
Right.
mean, that was a disaster for me. Also, changing the methodology of how you deduct interest on your home mortgage changed drastically up to a certain. So like there was things I didn't like about the
Yeah.
tax cut, but clearly more money did effectively get put into the pockets of people, and not just in a deferral basis, in a real basis. Now, if you want to show me numbers, an actual study that's independent that says that that's not what happened, I'm open to it. But from my
Yeah.
understanding,
I didn't know we were going to talk about this. The studies do exist, but in any case, it seems like, at least philosophically, we're getting a sense of where we are. So,
yeah,
yeah,
make an overarching point. And my overarching point is that when people think things are going to get better, it makes things get better. When people think things are going to get worse, they stop spending and it makes things worse. It's a great part of economics is self-fulfilling prophecies. And it goes back to the old thing from Franklin Rose. Only the fear is fear itself. Fear is paralyzing. Okay. Fear stops people from spending. It stops people from buying on their credit cards. That's why George Bush, who I didn't was not a big fan of the son W, right?
yeah.
Who said, hey, if you don't go out and spend, the terrorists win. I mean, like after 9/11, you know what I'm saying? So anyway, I think what you're missing here though is that when we talk about economic growth, you brought up a very valid point about the cost of toilet paper and toothpaste or whatever it might be, the cost of going out for dinner. When we talk about economic growth being a robust 4%, right? Does that, if you take that to the individual level, does that really matter to someone? Like, why should it matter? Because if someone's
But
making
hold on one second,
$50,000,
Jordan. I have to interject. 4% doesn't
automatically,
exist. Trump talked about 4%, but if we want to talk real numbers, we just got the 2019 report. It was 2.9.
I'm not making a, no, 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 no. I'm making a philosophical
Ah,
argument here
okay. All
about
right. Fair enough.
at 7%. I'm talking anywhere in the world. When we talk about economic growth in general,
Yes.
being 3% or 5%, it doesn't matter what the number is. What I'm saying is incrementally to the individual, if your paycheck goes up or down, you even strengthen about 3% or 2%. Does it really impact your life that much? If you made 50,000 one year and 49,000 next, is going to radically alter your existence? No, you're still going to buy toilet paper. You're still going to buy toothpaste. So these little things of like these little 3% growth is so robust. I mean, at the end of the day, so much of this is about perception. It's about how much credit is available for people. That to me is what really drives so much of economic growth. And I think that regulations, while regulations are important, I believe in deregulation, I still believe in financial regulation. In other words, I think in the financial world, there needs to be stringent regulation to avoid the sort of things that happened back in 2007. That was a joke and a disaster. And I saw it coming way before it happened. I did, because I was in the mortgage industry and I had been on Wall Street and I knew there was a disconnect between what people were saying and reality. I watched it happen. And all I'm saying is that when you're passing rules, I think a lot of the laws that were on the books that Trump did repeal were actually really beneficial to economic growth. But I'm not talking about Wall Street regulation. That's a different animal.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is, and I know you got to go in a second. What's interesting is our analysis of the growth being a self-fulfilling prophecy or contraction being a self-fulfilling prophecy is basically the same. Where I go further than I think you go is that when it is not based on a strong and real foundation, it ultimately leads to these boom and bust cycles where, yes, if the perception is positive, you'll get the spending in the short term. But if it's not built on a strong foundation, it will ultimately collapse, the way we saw, for example, with the mortgage crisis, where the perception was properties are going to be worth more. The banks were willing to lend. Credit was available, like you said, but it was a weak foundation. And so it imploded.
Well, that imploded for a number of reasons, starting with the biggest one being massive wholesale fraud at Standard and Poor's and Moody's. That's where it begun, and that's where that was what allowed it to happen, was a complete breakdown of the system that allowed companies like Goldman Sachs et al., okay, to have pieces of stamped AAA that should have never been stamped AAA. And that's what allowed all of this to happen. And the result was bankrupting Iceland and Greece and whatnot. Separate issue. Well, here's my take, just to close this whole thing up, because I got to go in a minute. I don't think we're far in our views, but I think there's a far greater issue here, and that is the fiscal deficit. All right.
We very much disagree. I think we definitely disagree on that one.
So I am very concerned. Okay, I deeply am concerned about the size of the deficit and the continually kicking the can down the road. And at a certain point, you got to pay the piper. And I don't know how you could disagree and say that's not a problem, but I'd love to hear how you say it's not a problem.
Well, it's a bigger conversation, but of course, number one, you have to look at the size of the deficit relative to GDP growth, because if the economy keeps expanding, you can have a larger number of dollars of deficit, but it's roughly the same percentage. So that's one thing that's important to think about. But if you check out modern monetary theorists, I believe that they make very strong points about deficits for economically stimulative government spending are not bad. Deficits for bad government spending, like tax cuts for the rich where the money gets stuffed into a bank account, that is not quite so good. So we probably disagree philosophically there.
Well, no, it's just those theorists. You know what they are? They're theorists. Okay.
Well,
all I know
we
is
all?
In the real world of business, in the real world of life, you cannot keep borrowing and borrowing and borrowing and not producing. You can't keep consuming and dumping money into guns and military and all this stuff. You cannot allow the government to just keep printing money. It ain't going to work forever. And that much I know I'm right about. When that day comes, who knows? But you
Yeah.
cannot keep borrowing because we do not live in fantasy land. So I know
Right.
most people, they work at probably at Goldman Sachs and the other companies, and that's why they say what they say, because it's in their interest to say that the think tanks and all these people, they're bought and paid for. Because in the real world, I don't care what, in the real world, you cannot borrow forever and borrow and borrow and borrow and keep borrowing. It's impossible.
Well,
That's just
a government is not a household, but I think that that's where we can we will agree to pause the conversation. I know you got to go, Jordan Belfort. Don't miss his book, The Wolf of Wall Street. Also, you can check out the movie. But
by the way, my podcast,
yes,
my podcast.
I
That
follow you. I follow Jordan on Instagram. He has awesome sales techniques and all sorts of cool stuff. Jordan, I really appreciate your time.
funny, but
All right, thank you.